November 23rd, 1942. 06:15 hours. Stalingrad, Soviet Union. Corporal Henrik Kruger crouched in the ruins of the Red October tractor factory, his frozen fingers fumbling with frost-encrusted binoculars. At 23 years old, he commanded what remained of his squad from the 6th Panzer Division of the German 6th Army. Around him, men stamped their feet against the merciless cold, their breath crystallizing instantly in the -17-degree air. The ground beneath their boots had become iron, littered with brass casings, and the dark contours of bodies nobody possessed the strength to bury. Kruger allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction despite the hollow ache gnawing at his belly. The city would fall within days, perhaps a week. Then, surely, the High Command would permit them to withdraw to proper supply lines. Something more than the watery gruel and 180 grams of sawdust-laced bread that constituted their daily sustenance. The Americans, he muttered to his loader, a gaunt private from Hamburg whose uniform sagged on his wasting frame. They send their boys to fight without proper training. Soft, pampered by their mongrel democracy. Their prisoners in our camps whine about the food. Can you imagine? He barked a laugh that dissolved into a racking cough. Meanwhile, our men here, the finest soldiers in the world, the inheritors of Frederick the Great's legacy, we endure true hardship for the fatherland. We understand sacrifice. The Americans, with their Negroes and Jews in uniform, they will shatter the moment genuine adversity finds them. The private nodded mechanically, though his thoughts dwelt on the half-frozen potato he had bartered from the quartermaster that morning. He was hoarding it for evening, something to anticipate. His stomach had ceased its protests days ago, replaced by a relentless hollow sensation that never departed. Around them, soldiers prepared for another day of urban warfare, checking their weapons with automatic movements. Many bore the peculiar sunken-eyed aspect that came from sustained malnutrition. The veterans called it the 1,000-yard stare. But it was not merely combat fatigue. It was hunger, pure and elemental. 3,000 kilometers west, at a prisoner-of-war camp near Kaufering in southern Germany, recently captured American airmen were indeed complaining. But Corporal Kruger possessed no means of knowing what was transpiring with German soldiers captured by the Americans in North Africa, in the deserts surrounding Kasserine Pass and Tunisia. What he didn't know, what none of the 285,000 men of the 6th Army now strangled within the Stalingrad pocket knew, was that their comrades held in American prisoner-of-war camps scattered across Texas, Oklahoma, North Carolina, and 30 other states were living better than the soldiers bleeding for the Reich. Far better. They were consuming eggs for breakfast, playing soccer on weekends, taking correspondence courses through American universities. They were gaining weight. By the time the Stalingrad pocket finally surrendered on February 2nd, 1943, after 72 days of encirclement, Henrik Kruger and the remnants of his unit would be skeletal figures, their bodies cannibalizing their own muscle tissue for survival. Kruger himself would spend 3 weeks trapped in the basement of a destroyed building near the tractor factory, where he had once felt confident. He would fight other German soldiers over rat bones. He would weep on his knees, begging for a piece of burnt cartilage. He would watch his comrade Miller freeze to death overnight, then strip the corpse for its dry coat. He would see his left thumb fall off when it brushed against his rifle barrel, the blackened digit dropping to the concrete floor like a discarded cigarette. He would watch Klaus hallucinate about his mother's hot soup, stumble into the snow without boots, and be found the next morning with his face gnawed by rats. They were scavenging frozen horse meat from the carcasses that littered the streets, boiling leather belts and boots for soup, picking through frozen excrement for undigested grain. In those final weeks, their average daily caloric intake had collapsed from an already inadequate 1,800 calories, barely enough for a sedentary civilian, to less than 500. Some days, less than 300. Men were literally starving to death while still at their posts, too weak to lift their rifles, dying quietly in frozen bunkers. Meanwhile, in camps scattered across 31 American states, from the pine forests of North Carolina to the cotton fields of Texas to the wheat farms of Kansas, German prisoners of war were consuming 3,000 to 3,200 calories per day. Not merely consuming, but complaining if the quality failed to satisfy, requesting specific foods, writing letters home that described meals which would have seemed like fever dreams to the men dying at Stalingrad. They were playing soccer in organized leagues with referees and spectators, taking university-level courses in calculus, engineering, English literature, even courses on American history and government, writing letters home about the bewildering abundance of food, the strange kindness of their captors, the impossible reality of their situation. Some were literally getting fat, gaining 10, 15, even 20 kilograms within the first year of captivity. The contrast was so stark, so cosmically unjust, so impossible to reconcile with everything the Reich had promised, that when German High Command finally learned the full truth through Red Cross reports and escaped prisoner debriefings in late 1943, they initially ordered the information classified and suppressed. How could they explain to the German people that the supposedly decadent Americans, the mongrel democracy that was supposed to collapse under the weight of its own degeneracy, were treating enemy soldiers better than the Wehrmacht High Command treated its own men in the field? How could they explain that the prisoners had won a lottery of survival, while the fighters, the true believers, died in agony for nothing? The answer would prove more devastating to Nazi ideology than any battlefield defeat, more damaging than the loss of an entire army at Stalingrad. It would reveal that everything they had been told about American weakness, about the iron discipline and superior efficiency of the German military system, about the biological superiority of the Aryan race, about the decadence of democracy, all of it was a lie. Not just wrong, but inverted. The truth was the exact opposite, and that lie had condemned hundreds of thousands of their finest soldiers to a death far more horrible than military necessity demanded. The arithmetic of it was brutally simple, reducible to numbers that even the most fanatical believer in National Socialist theory could not explain away. The United States had committed to following the Geneva Convention of 1929, not merely in letter, but in spirit, and in practice exceeded its requirements. Article 11 of the Convention required that prisoners of war receive the same rations as depot troops of the detaining power. American depot troops, soldiers in training camps or performing garrison duties, received generous rations by any standard. But the Provost Marshal General's Office, the agency responsible for the prisoner of war program, determined that German prisoners would receive rations equal to those of active duty American soldiers. Not just adequate food. The same food. The same quantities. The same quality. Between 1943 and 1945, German prisoners in American camps received daily rations that exceeded what many American civilians were getting under wartime rationing. They received more than British civilians surviving on ration cards in bombed cities. They received far more than German civilians, whose rations had been cut repeatedly as the war turned against the Reich. The Provost Marshal General's detailed records, preserved in the National Archives, document every meal, every calorie, every gram of protein for over 370,000 German prisoners held across more than 425 camps. The result was a daily menu that shocked German prisoners when they first encountered it, that seemed like some elaborate trick or propaganda exercise, until they actually ate the food and felt their bodies begin to recover from years of wartime deprivation. Breakfast at Camp Butner in North Carolina, a typical mid-sized camp housing 4,000 Germans, might include hot oatmeal or cream of wheat with fresh milk and white sugar, not the ersatz substitutes they had known for years. Scrambled eggs, real eggs from actual chickens, not powdered, not weeks old, fresh eggs, sausage or bacon, actual meat. White bread, soft white bread made from real wheat flour, not the sawdust extended black bread of wartime Germany, served with real butter and fruit jam. Coffee, real coffee, not the roasted grain substitute Germans had been drinking since 1940, served with fresh cream and sugar. Orange juice on Sundays. On Sundays, prisoners in American camps drank fresh squeezed orange juice. German prisoner Walter Struckmeyer, captured at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, was among the first wave of Africa Corps veterans sent to American camps. He arrived at Camp Butner in North Carolina in May 1943, weighing 57 kilograms, his uniform hanging loose, his ribs clearly visible. He had been fighting in North Africa for 18 months, subsisting on inadequate rations in the desert heat, watching his body slowly waste away. On his first morning in camp, he was served breakfast in the mess hall. Years later, in a 1968 interview with the German magazine Der Spiegel, he described that first meal with something approaching religious awe. "I thought I was hallucinating," he said. "I thought perhaps I had died and gone to heaven, or perhaps I had lost my mind. There was a plate in front of me with eggs, actual eggs, yellow yolks, white whites, scrambled, soft and steaming. There was sausage, brown and glistening with fat. There was bread, white bread, so soft I could squeeze it in my fist, and it would spring back. There was butter, real butter from real cream, yellow and soft. There was jam. There was hot coffee that smelled like coffee, not burnt grain. I started eating and I couldn't stop. I ate everything. I asked for more. They gave me more. I ate until my stomach hurt. Then I went outside and vomited because my body couldn't process that much food after so long. But I went back the next day, and the next day, and every day for 3 years. By October 1944, 18 months after his capture, Struckmeyer had gained 16 kilograms. He weighed 73 kilograms, more than he had weighed when he first enlisted in 1939. His uniform, the same one he had been captured in, had been altered 3 times by the camp tailor to accommodate his expanding waistline. In his letters home to his wife Margaret in Stuttgart, carefully worded to pass through both American and German censors, he tried to describe his situation. "The amount of food here would feed my entire street back home," he wrote in one letter, dated October 8, 1944. "I eat until I am full every single day. I have forgotten what hunger feels like. Sometimes I feel guilty. I should not be here eating while you are there suffering. But what can I do? They feed us whether we want it or not. The guards say it is required by the Geneva Convention. I have gained 8 kilograms since my last letter." That letter arrived in Stuttgart in early December 1944. By then, the city had been bombed repeatedly by Allied air raids. The ration cards that civilians depended on entitled them to 1,600 calories per day in theory. In practice, with supply chains disrupted and food stocks diminished, many were getting closer to 1,200. Margaret Struckmeyer shared her husband's letter with neighbours in the apartment building where she lived, one of the few still standing in their district. The reaction was complicated. Some women, whose husbands were fighting on the Eastern Front, suffering privations that made North Africa look comfortable, became angry. How dare he complain about guilt while eating American food? Their men were starving, freezing, dying. But others saw in the letter something more disturbing. If the Americans could feed German prisoners so well, while simultaneously fighting a war on 2 continents, launching massive bombing campaigns, supplying the Soviets and British through Lend-Lease, what did that say about the Reich's claims of imminent victory? What did it say about German efficiency, German discipline, German superiority? At Stalingrad, on that same October 8th, when Struckmeyer was writing home about his weight gain, Henrik Kruger was already in Soviet captivity. The survivors among the 90,000 Germans who had surrendered were dying at a rate exceeding 3,000 per day. Those still clinging to life in Soviet camps subsisted on what could barely be called food. A slice of black bread, if they were lucky 200 grams, sometimes less. Thin soup made from rotten vegetables and mystery ingredients, perhaps containing some protein from sources the prisoners tried not to contemplate too carefully. The water was contaminated, causing dysentery that killed weakened men within days. Medical care was non-existent. The camps had no medicines, no bandages, no doctors. Men died from infected wounds that would have been trivial with proper treatment. They died from diseases that well-nourished bodies would have fought off easily. They died from simple exposure, their bodies too weak to generate heat. Kruger himself would survive, one of fewer than 6,000 among the 90,000. The survival rate was 6.7%. 6.7. For every 100 men who surrendered, 93 died in captivity. He would spend 11 years in Soviet camps before finally returning to Germany in 1956, a broken man weighing 42 kilograms, his face permanently etched with the memory of Comrade Klaus, hallucinating about soup and dying in the snow. In American camps, by contrast, the survival rate of German prisoners approached 99.9%. Of the approximately 370,000 German prisoners held in American custody between 1942 and 1946, fewer than 400 died. Most of those deaths resulted from accidents, workplace injuries, or pre-existing medical conditions that would have killed them anyway. The actual attrition rate from maltreatment, malnutrition, or neglect was effectively zero. German prisoners in American camps were safer than German civilians in German cities. They were far safer than German soldiers anywhere on any front. At Camp Hearn in Texas, one of the largest American prisoner of war facilities, Camp Medical Records, from March 1944 document, a phenomenon that physicians found both amusing and troubling. The primary medical complaint among recently arrived prisoners was digestive distress caused by sudden overfeeding. Men whose bodies had adapted to semi-starvation by slowing metabolism, reducing digestion, conserving energy, suddenly faced with 3 full meals a day totaling over 3,000 calories, experienced severe stomach cramps, diarrhea, and vomiting. Camp doctors had to implement a graduated feeding program for new arrivals, slowly increasing rations over 2 weeks to allow bodies to adjust. By the 2nd month, the opposite problem emerged: weight gain, rapid weight gain. By the 6th month, the camp tailor shop was overwhelmed with requests for uniform alterations. The camp physician, a Captain Morris Weinstein from Brooklyn, kept detailed notes that were later incorporated into medical studies on refeeding syndrome. These men arrive looking like concentration camp victims, he wrote in his official report to the Surgeon General's office. Hollow cheeks, visible ribs, stick-thin limbs. Within 90 days they look like farmers. Healthy colour, filled-out faces, actual muscle mass. Within 6 months, some are frankly overweight. We're having to counsel them about portion control. We're putting enemy soldiers on diets. I find this simultaneously wonderful and utterly bizarre. The American system was designed with cold calculation. The War Department understood a truth German High Command had forgotten. How you treat enemy prisoners affects how your own are treated. Every letter home describing good treatment was a propaganda weapon stronger than bombs. Every letter told the same story. America had food. America had resources. America treated prisoners as human beings. But something deeper was at work. Something German theorists failed to understand. American abundance wasn't accident, temporary circumstance, or stolen resources. It was systemic, the product of fundamentally different organization, resource allocation, valuing of human productivity. The prisoners saw this firsthand, and it shattered every assumption about racial hierarchies and Germanic superiority. Take agriculture. German prisoners working on American farms across 24 states were confronted daily with mechanization that made German methods look medieval. A Texas cotton farmer, often a man in his 50s with his wife and maybe one hired hand, might own 800 acres outright. 800 acres. A German farmer with 50 acres was prosperous. They saw tractors, mechanical cotton pickers doing the work of 50 men, irrigation systems that eliminated rain dependence. They saw wheat yields of 30 bushels per acre, where German yields averaged 18. They saw livestock operations where one farmer raised 500 head of cattle with modern veterinary care. They saw silos filled with grain, barns full of equipment, storage for years, farming as industrial operation, not subsistence. And they understood why they were being fed so well. The United States had real surplus, actual, measurable, staggering surplus. American agricultural production in 1944 reached records across every category. Wheat harvest, 1,100 million bushels. Corn, 3 billion bushels. Meat, 24 billion pounds. The United States was producing more food than all of Europe combined, with fewer agricultural workers, through mechanization. German agricultural production collapsed. The blockade strangled imports. Labor shortages crippled farms. Allied bombing destroyed processing and distribution. By late 1944, Germany was stripping occupied territories, causing mass starvation in Poland, Ukraine, Greece, the Netherlands. The Dutch hunger winter killed over 20,000 civilians. Germany took their food. Still, it wasn't enough. Prisoners working in American canning factories watched production lines operate 24 hours a day, processing tons of vegetables. A single Del Monte facility in California processed more in a day than some German provinces produced in a month. They packaged food for American soldiers worldwide, British civilians, Soviet troops, and themselves. The circle was closed. They were packaging their own abundance. But food was only the most visible manifestation of American productive capacity. The industrial might that made food abundance possible was the same industrial might that was winning the war through sheer material superiority. German prisoners working in American factories, and thousands did under carefully controlled conditions that complied with Geneva Convention prohibitions on war-related labor, saw manufacturing operations that explained why Germany was losing. At a Ford facility in Michigan, prisoners watched assembly lines produce tractors at one every 11 minutes. Start to finish. The factory operated 2 shifts, produced over 100 tractors daily, one of 17 Ford plants making similar equipment, in addition to military production. The prisoners calculated. Germany produced approximately 10,000 tractors in 1943 total. This one factory, making civilian equipment during a world war, matched Germany's yearly output in 3 months. If this was civilian capacity, what did military production look like? They found out. Camp education programs, part of the re-education effort that began in 1944, included films and lectures on American war production. The numbers were presented as simple facts, not propaganda. American aircraft production in 1944, 96,000 planes. Tank production, 17,500. The prisoners sat in camp recreation halls, watching newsreels of bomber production at Willow Run, Ford's massive facility where B-24 Liberators rolled off assembly lines at a rate of 1 per hour. The Germans had been told that American industry was incapable of matching German quality and efficiency. They were watching proof that American industry had exceeded German production by orders of magnitude while maintaining quality standards that matched or surpassed German equipment. Lieutenant Werner Hollweg, an engineer who had worked in German military procurement before his capture, attended one of these presentations at Camp Como in Mississippi in March 1945. In his diary, which he maintained in violation of camp rules and later donated to the Imperial War Museum in London, he recorded his reaction. "The numbers cannot be correct," he wrote. "They are impossible. But I have seen American factories. I have seen their farms. I have seen their roads, their cities, their infrastructure. Everything they have built suggests these numbers are possible. If these numbers are real, if America truly produced 96,000 aircraft in a single year, then we never had a chance. Not at the beginning. Not at any point. The war was over before it started. We just didn't know it. German military censors faced an impossible choice. Suppress letters and violate the Geneva Convention, risking retaliation against German prisoners. Allow them through and reveal enemy prisoners ate better than German soldiers, better than civilians in bombed cities surviving on ration cards. They chose to let most through. Gambling people would not make the comparison. They gambled wrong. Hans Müller, captured at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, spent 3 years at Camp Barkley in Texas, working on an Abilene farm. His letters home described his routine with guilty wonder. "We wake at 5:45, he wrote in July 1944. "Real eggs for breakfast, Gretel, not powdered. Eggs from chickens, white bread and butter. I have seconds, sometimes thirds." Müller's letters arrived in Bavaria in October. Munich civilians received ration cards for 1,600 calories in theory, much less as supply chains collapsed. His sister shared letters with neighbors. Sentiment shifted in ways Nazi officials found alarming. If Americans fed prisoners so well while fighting 2 fronts, what did that say about German leadership's resource scarcity claims? About the 1,000-year Reich's efficiency? The American camps were not luxury resorts. They were prison camps, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. But within those confines, the United States had created something the Nazi leadership found incomprehensible. They had created a system that treated human beings as human beings, even when those human beings were enemies. Camp Butner in North Carolina housed over 4,000 German prisoners by December 1944. The camp had a library with over 3,000 books in German. It had a soccer field where weekend matches drew crowds of guards and their families who came to watch. It had educational programs where prisoners could take correspondence courses through area universities. Credits earned were recognized by German institutions after the war. Some prisoners earned the equivalent of a high school diploma. Others completed university-level courses in calculus, engineering, and business. The physical transformation was documented in camp medical records. Prisoners arriving from North Africa typically weighed between 55 and 65 kilograms, undernourished from years of desert warfare and inadequate rations. After 6 months in American camps, average weight increased to 70 to 75 kilograms. Many prisoners had to have their uniforms let out. The camp tailor shop at Fort Sam Houston in Texas kept detailed records of alterations. In 1944 alone, they performed over 2,000 waistline adjustments, making trousers larger to accommodate weight gain. The contrast with conditions in the field became impossible to ignore as the war progressed. A German infantry soldier on the Eastern Front in early 1945 received, when supply lines functioned at all, roughly 1,800 calories per day. This was barely sufficient for sedentary activity, wholly inadequate for combat operations in sub-zero temperatures. Soldiers supplemented rations by foraging, by taking food from occupied populations, by any means necessary. Many didn't supplement enough. Malnutrition was endemic. By the war's final months, captured German soldiers on the Eastern Front were skeletal. Soviet photographs of prisoners from this period show men who looked like they had emerged from concentration camps, but the most devastating comparison was Stalingrad itself. In the final weeks of the encirclement, from mid-January to early February 1943, soldiers of the 6th Army were receiving less than 100 grams of bread per day. 100 grams. Less than 4 ounces. Bread mixed with sawdust to make it last longer, as the historical records document. The human body requires a minimum of 1,200 calories per day to sustain basic metabolic function in cold weather without activity. Combat soldiers in winter conditions require closer to 4,000 calories. The men at Stalingrad were getting perhaps 300 to 500 calories on days when rations arrived at all. They died in the thousands. Not from Soviet bullets, though those killed plenty. They died from starvation, from exposure, from diseases that their weakened bodies could not fight. They died in cellars and bunkers, lying in their own filth, too weak to move. They died trying to surrender, too weak to raise their hands, shot down because Soviet soldiers thought they were reaching for weapons. They died in the first days of captivity on forced marches, their bodies simply giving out. 3,000 kilometers away, at Camp Shanks in New York, German prisoners who had been captured at Kasserine Pass, at Tunisia, at Sicily, were preparing to be transferred to work programs. They lined up for medical examinations. Army doctors noted their improved health, their weight gain, their generally good condition. Many had better dental care than they had received in the Wehrmacht. The camps had dentists. Regular dental checkups were provided. Cavities were filled. Infections were treated. In the Soviet camps housing Stalingrad survivors like Henrik Kruger, men died from infected wounds because there were no medical supplies. They died from dysentery because there was no clean water. They died from typhus because there was no delousing. They died and died and died, and the ones who survived would carry the scars for the rest of their lives. Kruger, in his 1968 interview with Der Spiegel, described learning about American camp conditions from a fellow prisoner who had been transferred from American to Soviet custody as part of a prisoner exchange. "He told us about the food," Kruger said. "We thought he was mad, delirious. 3 meals a day? With meat? Soccer games on Sundays? It was impossible. It had to be propaganda. But he insisted. He showed us photographs that he had hidden. American guards posing with German prisoners at Christmas. They were smiling, both of them. The prisoners looked healthy, fat, even. I could count my own ribs. I weighed 42 kilograms. My left thumb had fallen off at Stalingrad. My fingers were black stumps. I had eaten rat bones and boiled boots. And these men in the photographs, our comrades, they looked like they had never missed a meal. The American military bureaucracy documented everything. The Provost Marshal General's historical monograph on the prisoner of war program declassified in 1970, contains detailed nutritional data. German prisoners in American camps received, on average, 3,075 calories per day in 1943, 3,120 in 1944, and 2,915 in 1945, when American civilian rationing tightened. They were reported to the Swiss protecting power. They were facts. The facts were devastating to German morale. As the war turned against Germany, as letters from American camps continued to arrive, as the contrast between American treatment and German reality became undeniable, soldiers began to make calculations. If they were going to be captured, better by the Americans than the Soviets. Much better. After the Normandy invasion, German units on the Western Front increasingly showed reluctance to fight to the last man. Why die for a cause that was clearly lost when surrender meant survival, meant food, meant a chance to go home someday? The German High Command recognized the problem. In October 1944, General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel issued a directive attempting to counter the propaganda value of American camp conditions. The directive acknowledged that German soldiers were aware of good treatment in American camps and warned that this knowledge was undermining fighting spirit. It ordered tighter censorship of Red Cross mail and prohibited discussion of American camp conditions. The directive failed. You cannot censor reality. Too many letters had already gotten through. Too many families knew. By early 1945, German soldiers on the Western Front were surrendering in numbers that alarmed their commanders. At the Ruhr Pocket in April, over 300,000 German soldiers surrendered to American forces with minimal resistance. Many had simply walked away from their units. Post-war interrogations revealed a common theme. They knew about the camps. They knew they would be fed. They knew they would survive. They chose survival. The psychological impact extended beyond the war. Of 370,000 German prisoners held between 1943 and 1946, most returned with altered views. Provost Marshal surveys showed 74% reported positive views of democracy. 33% self-identified as anti-Nazi. Only 10% retained hardline Nazi views. These men returned to devastated Germany and became community leaders, businessmen, educators, politicians carrying memories of how the enemy had treated them, carrying knowledge that Nazi propaganda had been lies. Erwin Halfinger was 18 years old when he was captured in 1945. He was sent to Camp Butner in North Carolina. He worked on a local farm where the farmer's wife invited him to breakfast before work. "I had never seen so much food," he said in a 1998 interview. "Eggs, bacon, toast, orange juice. I thought it must be a special occasion, but no, this was every day." He became an American citizen. He went to medical school at Virginia Commonwealth University. He spent 40 years as an obstetrician in Richmond, Virginia. He delivered over 3,000 babies. "I never forgot the kindness," he said. Never. The calculus of abundance versus scarcity told a story no propaganda could obscure. The United States fed 130 million civilians, 12 million military, allies through Lend-Lease, and 370,000 enemy prisoners, while maintaining exports. Germany, with 69 million people, could not feed its own soldiers in the field. American agricultural production in 1944. 1.1 billion bushels of wheat, 3 billion bushels of corn, 24 billion pounds of meat, achieved despite losing millions of farm workers to military service, compensated by mechanization and productivity. Germany's agricultural production collapsed. The blockade, labor shortages, Allied bombing destroyed infrastructure. By late 1944, Germany stripped occupied territories, causing mass starvation. Even this proved insufficient. In 1944, the United States produced 96,000 aircraft, 17,500 tanks, 2 million trucks, launched 1,500 ships, manufactured ammunition, uniforms, medical supplies in quantities that dwarfed Axis production, all while maintaining civilian living standards far higher than any other combatant. Prisoners saw farms with tractors and mechanical harvesters that made German methods seem medieval. They saw factories with assembly lines and productivity that explained American output. A system based on efficiency rather than ideology, on results rather than racial theory. The re-education program, implemented in 1945, exposed prisoners to democratic ideas and Nazi atrocities through films, books, and lectures. But the most powerful tool was simply how they had been treated. 370,000 German prisoners learned that lesson in American camps. The transformation was not universal. Some remained committed Nazis, isolated in special compounds. But most, confronted with evidence, could not maintain the beliefs that had sent them to war. Henrik Kruger, the Stalingrad survivor who had once mocked American weakness from the ruins of the tractor factory, encountered former prisoners who had been in American camps when he finally returned to Germany in 1956. The difference in their experiences was almost incomprehensible. They were healthy, he said in his interview. They had kept their teeth. They could work. They had learned trades. Some spoke English. They had job prospects. I was a broken man. I weighed 50 kilograms. I had nightmares every night. I could not work. The frostbite had taken my toes, my fingers. I was 41 years old and I felt like an old man dying. The Americans had treated Butner in April 1946. He later recalled that the barbed wire had already been taken down. There was nothing preventing escape, but nobody tried. We all knew we were going home, he said. Finally going home. But I remember looking at the camp, at the buildings, at the place where I had spent 2 years, and thinking that I had been treated better here as a prisoner than I would be treated in Germany as a free man. That was a strange feeling. A sad feeling. The statistical legacy is clear. Of 370,000 German prisoners, all but fewer than 1,000 survived. 99.7% survival versus 6.7% at Stalingrad, 33% on the Eastern Front overall, 84% of French prisoners held by Germany, the most successful prisoner program in modern history, but the true legacy was human. The transformation of hundreds of thousands told they fought for civilization against barbarians, who discovered the barbarians treated them with more humanity than their own civilization. Knowledge that abundance was real, democracy could work, a nation built on liberty could be stronger than the 1,000-year Reich. Prisoners who gained weight in American camps, while comrades starved at Stalingrad, became ambassadors for a different society. They returned and rebuilt Germany not as the Reich's continuation, but as a democracy, modelled partly on what they observed in America. The Federal Republic emerging in the 1950s owed something to those who had seen Nazi lies about American weakness exposed. The men who suffered at Stalingrad, men like Henrik Kruger who lost his thumb, watched Klaus die in the snow, fought over rat bones, had sacrificed for nothing. Their courage, endurance, willingness to die, all wasted serving an ideology that could not feed them, could not win the war it started. The prisoners in America had sacrificed nothing, gained everything. They learned the truth the Reich could never acknowledge. In total war, the side with more resources, more food, more industrial capacity, more respect for human life, will win, always. The equations were undeniable. 3,000 calories per day versus 500. Survival rate of 99.7% versus 6.7%. A democracy that could feed its enemies versus a dictatorship that starved its heroes. The numbers told the story that no amount of propaganda could obscure, no ideological fervor could overcome, no military genius could redeem. Germany had lost the war the moment it chose guns over butter, conquest over commerce, racial fantasy over economic reality. The clearest proof of German defeat was not in Berlin's rubble or surrender documents signed at Reims. It was in faces of former prisoners returning from America, healthy and hopeful, standing next to skeletal Stalingrad survivors, broken and bitter. One group treated the enemy better than our own command had treated us. The irony was not lost on German veterans. The Nazi leadership had preached sacrifice, had demanded total commitment, had promised that German strength and discipline would triumph over American weakness and decadence. Instead, American abundance and systematic efficiency had crushed German improvisation and fanaticism. American respect for human life, even enemy life, had produced better outcomes than German worship of heroic death. The ideology had failed at every level. In 1968, a reunion was held in Munich for survivors of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. 147 men attended, all that remained of the 280,000 who had been encircled. Also invited were German veterans who had been prisoners in American camps. The organizers thought it would be interesting for the two groups to compare experiences. The reunion nearly ended in violence, as Stalingrad survivors confronted the reality of how different the war had been for prisoners in American hands. One survivor reportedly shouted, "You were eating eggs while we were eating our horses. You were playing soccer while we were dying in the snow. You were the lucky ones, and you didn't even fight as hard as we did." It was true. The prisoners had been lucky to be captured by the Americans rather than the Soviets, lucky to be captured early rather than late, lucky to be held in a country that had the resources and the will to treat prisoners humanely. Their luck was the product of American strategic decisions, American industrial capacity, and American adherence to international law, even when fighting an enemy that frequently violated it. Documents discovered in German military archives in the 1990s revealed the full extent to which American camp conditions affected German military thinking. An internal Wehrmacht memorandum from November 1944, marked top secret, analyzed the propaganda impact of prisoner treatment. It concluded that American camp conditions were causing significant erosion of fighting spirit among frontline units and recommended increasing rations for combat troops to counter the effect. The recommendation was marked impossible to implement due to supply constraints. They knew. German High Command knew that their soldiers in the field were being outfed by their prisoners in American camps. They knew it was destroying morale. They knew it revealed the fundamental weakness of their position, and they could do nothing about it. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years could not feed its own soldiers as well as the mongrel democracy fed its prisoners. The master race was starving while the supposedly inferior Americans ate their fill. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the contrast had become so stark that it required no propaganda, no exaggeration. The photographs spoke for themselves. German prisoners in American camps, healthy and well-fed. German soldiers liberated from Soviet camps, skeletal and traumatized. German civilians in bombed cities, hollow-eyed and desperate. The visual evidence destroyed any remaining credibility of Nazi claims about German superiority. Final repatriation began late 1945, continued through 1946. Many prisoners expressed reluctance to leave. Germany was devastated, divided, occupied, food scarce, jobs scarce, hope scarce. Some asked to remain, most could not, but approximately 5,000 to 10,000 eventually returned as immigrants, sponsored by farmers and businesses they had worked for. Werner Lobbach spent his last night in American custody at camp, treated as human beings by enemies. The other treated as expendable resources by their own command. The contrast told everything about which system deserved to survive. History delivered its verdict not through battles, but through bodies. Through the simple, irrefutable fact that German prisoners in American camps gained weight, while German soldiers at Stalingrad starved to death. Henrik Kruger lived to see that verdict rendered. He lived another 40 years after returning from Soviet captivity, working as a night watchman in Hamburg, never sleeping more than 3 hours at a time, waking with nightmares of Klaus in the snow, and Miller frozen stiff and his own thumb lying on the concrete floor. He never forgot. The men who had been in America never forgot either, but they remembered kindness instead of horror. That single fact contained more truth about the war than any propaganda, any ideology, any grand strategy. It was the truth that destroyed the Nazi myth forever, and the men who lived it, who experienced it, who survived to tell about it, made sure that truth would never be forgotten.